The sirens weren't what shocked me. It was the fact that Deborah Whitmore, the HOA president of our uptight gated community, was dramatically sprawled across her front lawn in a bathrobe, clutching her cell phone like it was a lifeline, screaming into it for a 911 operator to send emergency assistance immediately because I was apparently stealing her property with a lawnmower. 2 patrol cars pulled up fast, tires kicking gravel, only to find me calmly sipping iced tea beside my push mower and a very official land deed in my hand. I waved at the officers, pointed to the deed, then casually nodded toward the survey stakes lining up across what she believed was her flowerbed. It was the first time I ever saw an HOA president's jaw literally drop, and I'll never forget the sound that followed. Her scream echoed through the cul-de-sac like a tea kettle possessed. The kicker, she didn't realize that her entire house sat on my land. And today was the day she was going to find out. A month earlier, I had no clue what kind of chaos waited behind that white picket gate. I inherited the land from my late uncle, a quirky old man who bought odd parcels of property like other people bought baseball cards. When I pulled up in my truck, trailer in tow, the sun had just begun to warm the sleepy neighborhood of Briarwood Reserve, a self-proclaimed luxury HOA development filled with manicured lawns, surveillance cameras, and passive-aggressive welcome cookies. My lot wasn't connected directly to the community but bordered it, a patch of flat land overgrown with dry grass and a few forgotten stones marking corners that no one had bothered to look at in years. I planned to build a small cabin, maybe grow vegetables, and live out a quiet life without drama. That dream lasted exactly 36 hours. Deborah Whitmore appeared on my second day with a clipboard, mirrored sunglasses, and the unmistakable tone of someone who had never once questioned their own authority. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask about me or the land. She just announced, with all the grace of a cold court summons, that my shed violated HOA regulations, that lawn decor was restricted, and that there were visibility complaints from the adjacent properties. I blinked at her, trying to process how I had complaints without having met a soul yet. I politely pointed out that I wasn't part of the HOA. She smiled tightly and said, "That's not really how it works around here." That moment should have been the end of it, but it was just the beginning. Every morning I'd find new pink notices stuck to a post I hadn't even put up, demanding I comply with HOA code. I ignored them until one Saturday when a tow truck showed up trying to take my trailer. That's when I realized Deborah wasn't just annoying, she was determined. I confronted her, and she said the HOA had voted to extend oversight to bordering properties for community aesthetic continuity. I laughed. She didn't. The situation escalated quickly after that. I tried to access the property line information online, but Briarwood Reserve's documents had been updated with weird overlays. I went down to the county and discovered that for some reason, the original property lines were stored only on microfilm and hadn't been digitized yet. That alone raised my eyebrows. My instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. One evening I had a beer with an old friend from college named Vince, who worked as a surveyor. He came out with a drone and equipment just to take a look. "You're not gonna believe this," he muttered the next day. "Your property line doesn't just touch her yard. It cuts through it. Like deep. Her house is practically trespassing." At first, I thought he was joking. But when he showed me the satellite overlay and pulled up county records, it was clear. My land, according to the oldest legal documentation, extended well into what Deborah thought was hers. She had built her entire back extension, and part of her garage, on my soil. It was the kind of plot twist that makes your stomach drop and your mind race. How could something this big be missed? How could she not know worse? What if she did? I approached Deborah with caution. I wasn't there to gloat. I even showed her the maps and offered to talk it through. Her response: she laughed in my face, called me a scammer, and accused me of trying to intimidate a single woman. She slammed the door in my face and then, 3 hours later, filed a noise complaint and claimed I was erecting illegal fencing. That's when I knew I couldn't reason with her. I had to document everything. So I hired a certified land surveyor. I paid for full legal review of my deed and title. I even ordered historical satellite images through a university archive. The results were all the same. The original lot line had never been changed. The HOA had, at some point, simply ignored my property's existence and let Deborah build across it. The final straw came when I staked out the real line one morning, bright red flags and all. I didn't say a word to her. I just let the markers speak. That evening, I found them all yanked out and dumped on my driveway like broken twigs. She'd scribbled on one of them in permanent marker, "Nice try." I took photos and filed a trespassing report. Then came the call to the HOA board. I figured surely someone else in the community would see reason. But when I presented the evidence, the maps, the county stamp, they brushed me off. One of them even suggested I was misreading the document. That's when I noticed Deborah slipping one of the members a note across the table. It felt like a movie scene, except it was my real life, and I was realizing just how deep the denial ran. Deborah had the whole board wrapped around her finger. She wielded influence like a weapon. Even when faced with hard evidence, she doubled down. The next morning, she had the audacity to put up a private HOA property sign on the disputed strip. But what she didn't know was that I'd already scheduled a legal review with a county official. And the official's first words when he walked my property were, "She's living on your land, man. That's a mess." And that brings us back to today. The sirens, the lawnmower, the cameras starting to click as neighbors gather, half with popcorn. The officers step out, one already recognizing me from the previous false reports. Deborah starts sobbing and insists I'm trying to steal her house. One of the cops looks down at the deed I hand him, then back up at her and says, "Ma'am, this document is county verified. And it looks like your kitchen is on his property." She screams, full on banshee mode, "I'll sue him for everything." But for the first time, the cops aren't humoring her. They're asking for paperwork, proof, permits. As she spirals, I can't help but smirk. Because this wasn't the end of the fight. Not even close. This was just the day she finally realized she wasn't the queen of the cul-de-sac. She was a trespasser. And I wasn't moving. Not an inch. When the surveyor handed me the official report, it felt like holding a golden ticket dipped in dynamite. Every inch, every measurement was verified down to the decimal. It wasn't just a matter of principle anymore, it was fact. My land included a staggering 47% of Deborah Whitmore's actual house. Her garage, kitchen extension, part of her backyard patio, even a decorative koi pond she constantly bragged about during HOA meetings. All of it was on property that legally belonged to me. I stared at the document for several minutes, trying to decide whether I was more stunned or entertained. A few days ago, I had no idea who she was. Now I had legal authority to evict her dining room. Still, I wanted to go about it fairly, maybe even amicably. The next morning, I stopped by her place with copies of the survey results, neatly printed and placed in a manila envelope. I even included the contact information for the surveyor and the county official who verified it. When I knocked on her door, her blinds rustled violently and a moment later, the door cracked open about 6 inches. Her eyes were puffy and bloodshot, but her voice was sharp as ever when she snapped, "What now?" I calmly held out the envelope. "These are the verified results. I think it's best we look at this together and figure out a reasonable solution." She didn't take it. She didn't even look at it. She just laughed, not like it was funny, but like she was clinging to the idea that laughter could rewrite reality. "This again? Let me guess, your little fake survey? I already talked to a lawyer. You're bluffing, and this is harassment." I stood there for a second, then gently set the envelope down on the welcome mat. "You should read it, Deborah. It's real. And ignoring it won't make it go away." I turned and walked off her porch, listening to the sound of the door slamming behind me. I didn't have to wait long to confirm what I already expected. That evening, I found the envelope stuffed into my mailbox, torn and crumpled, with a bright red sticky note stuck on top that read, "Not recognized. Stay off HOA property." I chuckled and took a photo for the folder I had begun keeping labeled Evidence. By this point, I knew I needed legal backup. I met with an attorney named Jenna, a friend of Vince's who specialized in land disputes and property line encroachments. She reviewed everything: deeds, surveys, decades-old county maps, and even pulled up tax record. Her verdict was instant. She's in massive violation. You could file for a quiet title lawsuit or even seek damages. But knowing people like her, it's going to get worse before it gets better. She wasn't wrong. Jenna also uncovered something that made my jaw drop. Deborah had filed for a special tax break over the past 5 years by claiming expanded residential development on property she didn't legally own. In other words, not only had she built on my land, she'd used it to get money back from the government. I decided to test the waters again by attending the next HOA meeting. Vince came with me, mostly for moral support, but also because he was starting to enjoy the absurdity of it all. The meeting was held at the local clubhouse, and the second I walked in, conversations stopped. Deborah was seated at the head of a long table, surrounded by board members, all dressed like they were running a miniature version of the Senate. I requested time to speak, and to her credit, or maybe arrogance, she granted it. I laid out the facts calmly, presenting the original deed, the recent survey, and documents stamped and signed by the county assessor's office. I even offered copies to every board member. Deborah sat stone-faced the entire time, tapping her pen like a metronome of denial. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she leaned forward and said, "He's trying to strong-arm this community. He knows nothing about our regulations. This is classic predatory behavior, and it won't work here." One of the board members, an older man named Carl who seemed slightly less hypnotized by Deborah than the rest, asked, "What if the documents are accurate?" Deborah scoffed. "They're not. I checked with our internal maps, and they clearly show the property ending at the boundary fence." I stepped forward. "That fence was put up 15 years ago. It was never permitted or aligned with the county survey." Deborah snapped back, "You're calling our entire community structure invalid?" Vince leaned in then, clearly unable to hold back. "If the community structure is built on stolen land, then yes." The room burst into murmurs. Deborah rose from her chair, pointed at me, and yelled, "You're not part of this HOA. You have no voice here. Get out before I have you removed." I nodded slowly and said, "That's fine. Because the next place I'll speak is court." Over the next week, I started noticing strange behavior. A black SUV with no plates drove by my property multiple times. One night, someone knocked over my survey stakes again and spray-painted obscenities on my trailer. I installed cameras the next day and caught footage of a woman in a hoodie pacing back and forth at the boundary line with what looked like a can of spray paint in hand. The footage wasn't clear enough to prosecute, but it was enough to show motive. When I handed it over to Jenna, she added it to our growing file. The breaking point came when I discovered that Deborah had not only ignored all the evidence but had gone a step further. She filed a civil complaint against me for intentional disturbance of community peace, citing that my presence and construction activities were creating emotional stress for residents. She even attached photos of me mowing my own lawn, claiming it was part of a threatening intimidation campaign. Jenna's reaction to the complaint was a mixture of disbelief and professional glee. This just made it easier. She handed us motive, slander, and false claims, perfect for court. We filed our counterclaim that week. Alongside a formal request for land title correction and compensation, Jenna attached an offer for mediation, something the courts like to see. We made it clear. Deborah had two choices. She could purchase the portion of land she had built on, at market rate plus damages, or she could begin removal and restoration. We even offered a generous timeline to make it less devastating. Unsurprisingly, She didn't respond. But what surprised me most was that the very next morning, I woke up to find fresh markers staked across my boundary. They weren't mine. Deborah had installed new ones, with little HOA flags and laminated signs stating, "Property surveyed and verified by HOA committee." I stared at them, laughing. Her version of reality had reached a new level. She had fabricated her own survey to counter the one backed by state officials. And with that, I knew it was time to stop playing defense. I returned to the county office, got every stamp, every signature, and every dated proof of ownership I could. I walked into their legal records division and requested an enforcement letter to be served. Jenna drafted the document that would mark the beginning of the end. It wasn't just a letter, it was a legal notice of encroachment, complete with a timeline and consequences. Deborah had officially pushed the situation from dispute into violation. And I was done being polite. What she didn't realize yet was that this wasn't going to end with another screaming match on the lawn or an HOA vote. The law didn't care about her laminated flags or her committee's fake map. The law cared about deeds, and mine showed her home was sitting on land that didn't belong to her. She'd built her fortress on borrowed ground, and now it was time for the real owner to take it back, piece by piece if necessary. The day I walked into the county records office to finalize the land encroachment enforcement, I didn't expect to be treated like a minor celebrity. The clerk behind the desk raised an eyebrow when I slid the folder toward her and said, almost with a smirk, "Is this the HOA case?" I nodded cautiously, and she grinned before calling over another staff member. Apparently, word had spread. Not because of gossip, but because the HOA president had already been there 3 times in the past week trying to preemptively discredit the records, waving hand-drawn maps and community declarations like they could override decades-old deed. I wasn't just fighting Deborah anymore. I was challenging an entire delusional structure that had never imagined someone could hold up a mirror and show them their kingdom was built on sand. Once the county enforcement officer, Marcus, took over, things shifted quickly. He visited my property himself, walked the boundary line with the official maps, and shook his head halfway through. "You've got the cleanest documentation I've seen in a while. And she's built over 20 feet onto your lot." I asked him if he had dealt with something like this before. He nodded slowly. "A few times. It always ends one of 2 ways. Either the violator backs off and pays up, or it goes to court and ends in tears." When I asked whose tears, he smiled and said, "Not yours." Meanwhile, Deborah was ramping up her tactics in a way that went from petty to downright theatrical. She hosted a so-called emergency town hall under the guise of protecting HOA property values. She claimed that a rogue neighbor was trying to bulldoze her home to build a chicken coop. She showed blurry, zoomed-in pictures of my shed and labeled them unapproved commercial structures. I only knew this because a neighbor, Angela, who had grown tired of Deborah's antics, recorded the entire meeting and sent me the audio. Hearing Deborah's voice shake with performative outrage while describing me as an aggressive squatter who threatens children's safety was as bizarre as it was insulting. I had lived peacefully, said little, and responded only when provoked. But in her world, I was the villain. After the meeting, something snapped in the HOA's unity. 3 members of the board resigned within a week, and one even sent me a message through my attorney apologizing for not speaking up sooner. It turned out they had known about the questionable property lines for years but were pressured by Deborah to stay quiet because it would scare potential buyers. That detail alone made Jenna's eyes widen when I told her. She suppressed information about a known boundary dispute while leading a real estate campaign? That's real liability. This isn't just trespassing anymore, it's fraud. Deborah, oblivious or unwilling to see the wall closing in, doubled down again. She filed a restraining order. Not just against me, but against my surveyor and Jenna too. The grounds were ridiculous. She claimed emotional harassment, property intimidation, and intentional undermining of community trust. When the court date came, I brought every document I had, along with Marcus, the county enforcement officer, as a witness. Deborah walked in with a binder the size of a microwave, and a new lawyer, who looked like he realized what he had signed up for about 10 minutes too late. The judge, an older woman with sharp glasses and zero tolerance for nonsense, read through the claims quickly before glancing up and asking, "Ma'am, do you have any legal evidence that you own the land in question?" Deborah started into a long explanation about community trust, generational living, and emotional investment in her property. The judge stopped her after 2 minutes. "I asked for legal evidence." Deborah fumbled for a moment, then pulled out one of the HOA's internal map. The judge took one glance, then turned to Marcus. "Is this map recognized by the county?" Marcus replied, "No, Your Honor. It's not even scaled properly. It's decorative at best." The courtroom chuckled. Deborah's face went pale. Jenna stood up and presented our entire binder, time-stamped, stamped, notarized, and certified. The judge didn't take long. She denied the restraining order immediately and then, before banging the gavel, looked directly at Deborah and said, "If what I see here is accurate, you should be preparing for a very different legal process soon. One that involves surrendering part of your home." Deborah stormed out of the courtroom with cameras flashing. Apparently, a local reporter had caught wind of the drama and filed a request to view the court document. By the next morning, the headline read, "HOA President accused of building on stolen land, Judge issues warning." That article was the spark that set the neighborhood ablaze with whispers. Some residents were furious that they hadn't been informed of the dispute earlier. Others defended Deborah blindly, clinging to the belief that HOA authority somehow outweighed legal ownership. But the truth was too loud to ignore now. And the video of the judge's ruling, though grainy, was already circulating online. A popular YouTuber even did a reaction breakdown titled, "When Karen Picks a Fight with the Deed." Deborah's response was to host another meeting, this time, excluding me entirely. She locked the clubhouse doors and announced it was a residents-only event. But someone leaked the agenda. The main bullet point was terrifyingly ambitious: proposal to purchase disputed land via HOA emergency budget. Jenna and I couldn't stop laughing when we read that. Not only did she plan to use HOA funds to buy back land that was never hers, but the board was already fractured, and her budget didn't come close to covering even a tenth of the property's value. The next major blow came from the insurance company. One of the former board members tipped me off that Deborah had attempted to file a homeowner's policy update. But once the insurance provider saw the court documents and survey maps, they froze her policy and initiated a formal review. Without coverage, any legal action or forced removal would hit her financially like a freight train. Her lawyer tried to call Jenna to negotiate, offering a partial payment in exchange for dropping the enforcement. Jenna didn't even blink before replying, "He's not selling. He's reclaiming. And every day you delay, the damages increase." The first sign that Deborah had finally realized she wasn't going to win was the sudden silence. For weeks, she'd been the loudest presence in the neighborhood, posting updates on the HOA bulletin board, organizing emergency meetings, and distributing poorly written flyers filled with words like fraudulent, invader, and land theft in bold capital letters. But once the 30-day notice from the county was officially posted on her front door, it was as if someone had turned down the volume on her entire existence. The neighborhood took notice too. Where once there had been whispers and muttered conversations behind garden hedges, now there were outright stares. Residents walked their dogs a little slower near her home, phones discreetly angled in her direction, some even nodding at me in quiet acknowledgement as they passed my lot. I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. While the legal side was almost finished, the emotional toll was beginning to weigh heavier. This wasn't just about winning a land dispute anymore. It had become a strange psychological battle, me trying to protect what was mine, her trying to convince the world that the rules didn't apply to her. That kind of delusion doesn't unravel quietly. I knew a storm was coming, even if I couldn't see it yet. I spent the next week preparing the site. My contractor, Dan, was a calm and seasoned professional who dealt with similar property reclamation cases before. He brought a crew out to evaluate what equipment would be needed. They marked the edges with paint, checked for underground lines, and verified that only the portion of her house on my land would be affected. It was surgical. Everything else would remain untouched. Dan kept it professional, but even he raised an eyebrow when he walked the line. Man, they built her kitchen right into your lot. Like 10 feet deep. It's not even close. What was she thinking? I didn't have an answer. Maybe she hadn't been thinking. Or maybe she just thought no one would ever stand up to her. A few days before the scheduled demolition, Deborah finally resurfaced. She walked across the boundary line like it was a battlefield, hands shaking slightly but voice still laced with that same old arrogance. "I want to make a deal," she said. I stood quietly, waiting for her to continue. "If I sign over a portion of the HOA greenbelt behind your shed, you drop everything. No demolition. No court. We pretend none of this happened." I looked at her, stunned. That land was already part of my original parcel. She was offering me what I already owned. The delusion ran deeper than I thought. I shook my head. "Deborah, that's not how this works. You're not in a position to negotiate imaginary trade. That notice on your door was real. And the equipment arrives Monday." She didn't take it well. Her face twisted with fury. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You think you're the hero here, but you're just a petty squatter with a lucky document." I didn't say anything. I just turned and walked back to my porch. By the time I looked back, she was already gone, storming across the grass she no longer had any legal right to stand on. That weekend, she made her last stand in true dramatic fashion. On Saturday morning, she put up a large banner across her porch that read "Save Our Community" in red paint, as if the demolition of a stolen kitchen would somehow collapse the entire neighborhood's identity. She arranged folding chairs in her driveway and invited reporters. A local news van actually showed up, and Deborah delivered a passionate speech about integrity, generational property, and the cruelty of legal technicalities. But when a journalist asked to see her deed, she changed the subject. And when another mentioned that the judge had already ruled against her, she ended the interview abruptly. Dan and his crew arrived early Monday morning. A flatbed truck carried the small excavator, and a few guys unloaded tarps and fencing. Marcus, the county enforcement officer, pulled up right behind them, clipboard in hand. Neighbors gathered cautiously, some pretending to check mailboxes while others openly recorded everything. Deborah stood on her lawn in a robe again, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like she still believed someone would yell cut and this would all turn out to be a prank. Marcus did a final walkthrough, double-checked the coordinates, and gave Dan the go-ahead. The crew worked efficiently. The fencing went up, blocking off the portion of my land that her structure occupied. Deborah screamed the moment the saws came out. "You're destroying a woman's home," she yelled. "This is government overreach." No one responded. The crew wasn't interested in her theatrics. They began by removing the patio deck. Piece by piece, they unscrewed the boards and stacked them neatly. Next came the back wall of her kitchen extension, followed by the attached garage corner. The noise was steady but not chaotic. It wasn't a violent takedown, it was controlled, measured justice. To the average observer, it might have looked excessive, but anyone who knew the story could see that it was a long-delayed correction. One neighbor, a retired engineer named Walt, stood near the edge of the sidewalk and said quietly, "I remember when she built that kitchen. She never pulled a permit. We all knew something was off." Another nodded. "She made me repaint my mailbox once because it was too whimsical. Guess karma got tired of waiting." Deborah made one final attempt to stop the demolition. She stepped into the work zone and started shouting at the crew. Marcus calmly walked over, read her the restraining order, and instructed an officer to escort her back to her driveway. That's when she started crying, real, chest-heaving sobs that didn't seem fake anymore. The weight of everything was finally crashing down on her. But even then, there was no apology. No acknowledgement that she had overstepped for years. Only rage and despair at being held accountable. By mid-afternoon, the job was mostly done. The extension was gone, the ground leveled, and the fencing repositioned to reflect the true property line. Marcus signed off on the job and Dan's crew packed up. Deborah sat on her porch in silence, not even looking up as the trucks drove away. Her once proud house now had a jagged back edge and exposed insulation where her illegal addition had been. It looked like someone had taken a bite out of her empire. The strange thing was, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no fist-pumping, no victory dance. Just a quiet sense of resolution. The truth had won. The law had prevailed. And I had protected my land without stooping to the kind of behavior she had made a lifestyle. That night, I poured a glass of whiskey and sat by my shed, staring at the cleared ground that had once been buried beneath her lies. The stars above were sharp and clear, and for the first time since moving there, the air didn't feel heavy. Word spread quickly. The video footage circulated online within hours. A popular Instagram page uploaded a time-lapse of the demolition set to classical music, and the comments exploded. Some called it satisfying. Others joked about HOA karma. But a surprising number of viewers commented on the importance of standing your ground, of not letting entitled people bully their way into stealing what doesn't belong to them. Over the next few days, the neighborhood dynamics began to shift. Neighbors who had avoided me before now waved. A couple even brought over cookies. One woman, Sandra, brought her teenage son by and said, "I'm glad you did what you did. She fined us last year because our car window tint violated neighborhood brightness standards. We've been waiting for someone to finally put her in her place." The HOA board held an emergency vote later that week. Deborah was removed as president in a unanimous decision. Carl, the soft-spoken board member who had once questioned her logic, stepped in as interim president. He approached me the day after the vote and handed me a letter. It was an official apology from the board, acknowledging their mishandling of the situation and pledging to implement safeguards to prevent similar abuse of power. I thanked him, not because I needed the apology, but because it felt like the chapter was finally closing. But one part remained unresolved. Deborah hadn't left. She still lived in the gutted house, now awkwardly lopsided and under partial construction hold. Rumors swirled about lawsuits, insurance denials, and plummeting resale value. I didn't care anymore. I had what I came for: my land, my peace, and the proof that even in a world of fake flags and self-declared authority, real ownership still mattered. And sometimes, all it took was one man with a deed, a surveyor, and a little patience to bring the whole facade crashing down. 2 weeks after the demolition, the dust had settled, literally and metaphorically. The once contentious border between my land and Deborah's ruined home was now clearly marked with fresh survey stakes, a clean gravel line, and a modest wooden fence that I'd built myself. No drama. No insults. Just quiet boundaries, as they should have been from the start. The area that had once been a disputed no-man's land was now my garden in progress, lined with small fruit trees and planters and a path that wrapped peacefully around my cabin. I'd even added a bench near the far corner. Sitting there each evening, looking out over land that had once been claimed by arrogance and denial, now reclaimed by truth, was the kind of peace I hadn't known I needed. But peace doesn't sit well with someone like Deborah Whitmore. She tried to keep a low profile after her removal as HOA president, but even in silence, she found ways to radiate resentment. Her house, now an awkward shell of its former self, stood out among the otherwise pristine homes of Briarwood Reserve. The jagged, unfinished wall at the back of her kitchen was a daily reminder of her defeat. She covered it with a tarp and wooden boards, but everyone knew what lay beneath. It became a local landmark, a sort of living monument to what happens when entitlement meets consequence. People stopped calling it Deborah's house. They started calling it the half house. Deborah wasn't done, though. She filed one last civil suit against me, claiming emotional damages, neighborhood defamation, and structural loss. Jenna didn't even flinch. She countersued for malicious prosecution, false HOA citations, and vandalism tied to the spray-painted trailer incident weeks back. Deborah's case unraveled within days. The judge dismissed it as a retaliatory action, and Jenna made sure to request reimbursement for every cent I had spent on legal defense. Deborah was ordered to pay my legal fees, which she could only partially afford. The court allowed her to set up a monthly payment plan, and that's when the final irony hit home. Deborah Whitmore, who once ruled the HOA like a queen, would now be paying me monthly restitution for the foreseeable future. But even after all that, she still hadn't learned. One Saturday morning, as I was planting a few herbs near the back fence, I heard shouting coming from her side of the property. I peeked over and saw a new set of men unloading building materials from a truck. Deborah was directing them toward the edge of her lot, my lot, actually. They began measuring again, this time for what looked like a sunroom or a second attempt at a patio. I dropped my trowel and calmly walked over to the edge of my land. "You're kidding, right?" I asked, startling her. She jumped, then folded her arms in a huff. "I'm not building on your land," she said. "This is a temporary structure for personal use. It doesn't fall under the county's definition of a permanent addition." She must have thought she'd found some kind of loophole. I called Marcus again. He showed up within the hour. After surveying and reviewing the new materials, he issued a warning on the spot. "If even a nail crosses the line again, the penalties will double. This is your last warning." Deborah didn't argue. She just stood there, jaw clenched, her face a storm cloud of frustration and humiliation. The crew packed up and left before the sun even dipped behind the trees. From that point on, she didn't make another building attempt. But she did try subtle tactics, planting small flower pots along the property line, hanging wind chimes that extended slightly over the fence, setting a motion detector light that triggered every time I stepped outside. It was exhausting in a different way, the slow psychological drip of someone who couldn't let go of the past. I kept a journal of every incident, every passive-aggressive move, every violation. I never reacted. I just recorded and waited. Eventually, the HOA, under Carl's new leadership, got involved again. They issued a letter to Deborah stating that her actions were disruptive to the community atmosphere and not aligned with HOA principles. It was poetic justice, really, watching her be reprimanded by the very rules she had once used to torment everyone else. The wind chimes came down. The lights were redirected. The pots vanished. Then came the final chapter. One crisp morning, a black SUV pulled up outside her house. A woman in a business suit got out, clipboard in hand, followed by a man with a real estate agency badge. Deborah met them at the door. There was no drama this time, no yelling or resistance. She simply nodded, let them inside, and within the hour, a for sale sign was hammered into the front lawn. The listing appeared online that same day, but the price was noticeably lower than any other home in the neighborhood. The description was vague and overly positive. Charming fixer-upper, full of potential, minor boundary dispute resolved. The house sat on the market for a while. Buyers came, saw the jagged back wall and the infamous history attached to it, and passed. Eventually, she found a buyer, a young couple from out of state who saw it as a project with a steep discount. They didn't seem to care about the past. They were focused on rebuilding and starting fresh. I introduced myself when they moved in and offered a copy of the property map, just to avoid future confusion. They laughed and said, "We already know the story. We saw the YouTube video. But don't worry, we're here to plant tomatoes, not flags." Deborah left quietly. No farewell party. No neighbors waving goodbye. Just a moving truck one morning, and an empty driveway by nightfall. I watched from my porch as the last box disappeared into the back of the truck. She never looked in my direction, and I didn't wave. There was nothing left to say. That night, I walked the boundary one last time, not because I expected a problem, but because it had become something of a ritual. Where once there had been conflict and tension, there was now clarity. My land was my own again. The line was real, marked not by battles or court orders, but by understanding, and maybe a little sweat from hammering in a dozen fence posts. I looked at the place where her kitchen used to extend, now a level strip of gravel and new grass. My fruit trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sun set low over the horizon. For the first time in months, it felt like the land had exhaled. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It had to be earned, fought for, piece by piece, brick by brick. But it was here now, and it was mine. Deborah's chapter was over, her legacy reduced to whispered stories and shared videos titled things like, HOA President Gets Schooled by Deed Owner. People came and went, but the land stayed. The lines didn't lie. And in the end, truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to stand its ground. And I was more than happy to stand with it.